Evening. Welcome. My name is Sarah Jones, and I'm the director of the Marin County Free Library, and it's my incredibly distinct pleasure to welcome you to the 11th annual One Book One Marin. Yeah, indeed. We are we've had just a wonderful One Book One Marin this year with a tremendous book, and you are in for a real pleasure this evening. But first of all, I wanted to just say a few things. This is not possible without a tremendous amount of support from a number of people and a number of sponsors that make this all possible so that we can bring you an author of this caliber, a wonderful book, and all the programming that goes along with that. So in particular, I would like to note Private Ocean, the Bank of Marin, and the Gilardi family, who are tremendous donors to help One Book One Marin be so very successful. In addition to that, yeah, that would be great. Thank you. In addition, as many of you know in the audience, that this is a truly collaborative event. The Marin County Free Library, we're happy to be a central part of it, but we certainly do it with some wonderful collaborative partners, Book Passage and Dominican University, and also the libraries, in the city libraries here in Marin, the Belvedere Tiburon, the San Rafael Library, the Larkspur Library, the Mill Valley Library, the San Anselmo Library, and in addition to all those libraries and the wonderful workers that put so much of this event together, we have wonderful support organizations that also give contributions to make sure that this is such a wonderful event. And those include our friends and our foundation. And I always just want to make sure that I know everyone in the audience is supporters of libraries and certainly supporters of Friends and Foundation. But your support is more critical than ever. So make sure that you not only give, which we like a lot, but also be an advocate, because libraries are a bit under fire right now, and we're going to need everyone in this whole country to get behind us. So, I also want to mention some other sponsors that have really made a difference for us this year: the Hamilton Federal Credit Union, the Computer Connections, Raphael Floors, Toscalito Tire, and our media sponsor, the Marin Independent Journal. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce one of the primary wonderful partners that we have that make this all possible, the Book Passage and Elaine Petrocelli.
Professor Michael Krasny has been a supporter of One Book One Marin from the very first day that the librarians came and said, let's do this. And I wrote to him and he said, yes, let's do this. And he gives up his time to come in and do these amazing interviews with our One Book One Marin authors. And I notice, I want to warn Anthony that sometimes people find themselves saying things on stage here that they hadn't planned to tell even their spouse. So you never know what's going to happen in a Michael Krasny interview. Yeah, Professor Krasny is known for his scholarly works, but also for the books he writes for those of us who are not PhDs in literature. His fabulous Off Mic talks about what it's like to have his job on Forum and all the people he has interviewed. Spiritual Envy, An Agnostic's Quest is a gorgeous book about philosophy and fun. I highly recommend it. And his latest book, we have sold over 2,000 copies of Let There Be Laughter by Michael Krasny. This is a treasure. It's got all the great Jewish humor that you've ever needed to hear. And you will be very, very popular if you are invited to a Seder tomorrow and you bring this book. And so I highly recommend it. Professor Krasny, in addition to teaching at San Francisco State University, is teaching at Stanford right now, and he very graciously changed his class schedule to be with us tonight. So I so appreciate what he does for us, and I know we all do. When Anthony Marra first came on the radar at Book Passage, it came to us in a manuscript with the type pages from the Hogarth editor, who said, Please read this. I'm so excited about this new author. And it was a book called A Constellation of Vital Phenomenon. And we have a committee at Book Passage that picks a book every month that we feature and send to people who let us choose a book for them every month. And it was unanimous when we read this amazing book, set in wartime and a difficult time, but his humor comes through and the humanity of all the characters. And then he came up with this magnificent book that we've chosen this year, The Tsar of Love and Techno, set in Russia, starting at the time of Stalin, coming all the way through to now. And you are going, if you haven't read it, you are going to love these characters. There will be things that you will need to talk to people about. So if you poor thing, you aren't in a book club, you don't go to the library meetings, come on in to the bookstore, and we love to talk about this book. There's just so much there. But lucky us, we get to hear Anthony Marra and Michael Krasny talk tonight. So thank you both for being here.
Thank you, Elaine, and thank you all for being here. It's good to be back to Dominican. In fact, just a little anecdote. I had a lunch today with some, as many of you know, I've been teaching at San Francisco State for decades, and they told me this afternoon that they established an endowment in my name, which was very exciting, and I was very happy to hear. But the reason I mention that is because I told them I was also given an honorary doctorate here at Dominican. It's one of the things that I feel attached to Dominican about, and made a point of saying to them, these things happen usually, endowments or honorary doctorates, when you either give a lot of money or you do a lot of public service, and the latter has nothing to do with my getting this recognition. That is bountiful and largesse amounts of money. But I'm delighted to be here with Tony Marra. He was on my radio program, and I think, is a pretty, could I hear from the audience here, gifted writer, would you say? And I wanted to hear that applause, and I think it's good because his parents are here tonight from Washington, D.C.
It's true.
So let's begin with, we talked a little bit earlier, and he told me he is working on a new novel, and I didn't want to know more about it than that. I want to be surprised, but it does not take place in Russia or in Chechnya, and yet that's been very fertile ground for you. I know you spent time there, but talk about what the draw is, what the magnet is, what compels you or ignites you about particularly that terrain, that culture, that world.
Absolutely. I first became fascinated with Russia and Chechnya when I was a college student at St. Petersburg State University, and I was there sort of at the tail end of the Second Chechen conflict, and I would see these young cadets marching around the neighborhood in military formation every day, wearing these beautiful blue uniforms, and they would march past these homeless veterans of a war that they might one day join. And so every day I saw these young, bright-eyed kids and these destitute veterans. And that's really when I began thinking about this terrain, particularly in the Northern Caucasus, but also Russian history more generally, because for me it's a place that is, above all, a place of extremes, geographically, historically, politically, in terms of simply climate. It veers at the far ends of the spectrum of human experience. And so many of these places and their histories, particularly over the course of the 20th century, really allow a writer to magnify moral choice. And to see how decisions that we in America are fortunate enough to not have to pay too much mind to, might in a place like the Soviet Union be routed through, you know, politics and history in these ways that really sort of illuminate the morality of an entire society.
Well, you obviously, you know, did a good deal of research. It comes through in your work. How much did you immerse yourself in Russian literature? I mean, particularly aside from the usual suspects, Dostoevsky and Tolstoy, Chekhov. Did you read, for example, Gorky, Turgenev? Did you find that you really had an appetite for that as well?
I did, but in terms of actually creating these worlds, it was actually much more nonfiction. It was more Russian journalists and memoirists and European and Americans who
Who's that woman? I can never pronounce her name. Anna
Politkovskaya.
Yeah, who wrote the Chechen Diaries.
Yeah, the Chechen Diaries, A Small Corner of Hell. She is someone who was assassinated in 2006. Many think it was with the approval of Putin. And writers like that, whose nonfiction has the weight of a Tolstoy novel, who deal with, you know, with contemporary Russia with the exact kind of you know, just of presence and intellect and outrage that, you know, that a great novelist will pay to the past on the page.
You're dealing with the complexity of human nature. It's certainly one of your strong points, and what E.M. Forster would call round characters. I mean, the characters often are palpable and come off the stage and are fully realized. But it's something to really challenge a writer, I would think, to go to another culture and to go to another nationality and try to know those people. I mean, they're universal human. One could argue you empathize with them, but they're very different than the people you grew up with, the people who are more accustomed to being with in America. Absolutely,
and I think there's maybe a danger in that idea of thinking that you're writing about a people. I think that's maybe the first mistake. I try to think that I'm writing about, you know, maybe 6 individuals, and leave it at that. I think that the idea that any book written by you know, an outsider can speak for that particular place is you know, is a bit ethically risky, I think.
But some of your stories are interconnected, and the characters' lives in different ways touch and so forth. So you sit down in terms of your craft and map it out?
Yeah, well, I mean, the wall of my office, my girlfriend once said that it looks like a serial killer's bedroom. I've got I've got, you know, balls of yarn running all over, and and it's kind of a bit of a mess. But yeah, with the Tsar of Love and Techno, I sort of created each story individually, and it was actually after Constellation, A Vital Phenomena was published. I had this second book, The Tsar of Love and Techno, under contract, and each story was completely separate. It wasn't at all connected or woven together. And I would come to events like, you know, like this, and afterwards, people would ask, "What are you working on next?" And I would say, "A short story collection." And you could just see the sadness and disappointment just come over them. And it was you know, it was like I had just admitted that you know, something I shouldn't have admitted in public, something that I wasn't quite intimate enough with my corresponding counterparty to divulge. But it got me thinking about how we as readers think about short stories here in America. That we have, you know, some of the truly great all-time short story writers, and you know, in the history of the genre. And when we publish short story collections, when we look at them in the bookstores, when they're reviewed, they're often treated as kind of the minor leagues. So it's either something that a young writer is doing on their way to writing a good novel. It's something that, you know, established writers do when they're a bit lazy. They just sort of go through the back drawer and throw some stuff together. And I began thinking about how the short story collection as a form, despite the way that, that our literary culture somewhat disparages it, actually has the capacity to be much bigger and much more ambitious than a novel ever could because of its fragmentation. And so my goal with the Tsar of Love and Techno was to take this somewhat maligned form and use it to create a narrative that I could never fit into a novel. To take a book and that begins as a short story collection and that ends as a novel, to use the short story almost as a chapter rather than a discrete entity. There's no good term for that in English. We call it linked stories, which sounds like a dating website or.
Well, but there's also a tradition, especially in American literature, of stories that are connected to be like a novel. You go back to Winesburg, Ohio by
Right.
Sherwood Anderson, or In Our Time by Hemingway, or Go Down Moses by Faulkner. I mean, there are, in fact, more recently, Visit
Jennifer
from the Goon
Egan,
Squad by Jennifer
yeah.
Egan, yeah. So, but that wasn't your plan. You were writing stories.
These were stories. I wanted each one to be able to stand totally alone. Most of them were published in one form or another in magazines as these standalone pieces. And yet, when you see them side by side, you see how they are all these sort of fragments in a larger mosaic.
Well, I think my friend Ethan Kane was a professor of yours at the University of Iowa.
Yeah.
And
He's actually, it's his fault that I wrote my first book. Constellation started out as this terrible short story. And it was maybe 30 pages long, and I had crammed the entire plot of the book into 30 pages. It read like a Wikipedia summary. And I brought it into workshop, and it was the very first story that I workshopped in graduate school, my first time at this program. And afterwards, it was clear that he was trying to think of a nice way to get me to leave him alone. And so he said, "Why don't you turn this into a novel? Come back and see me then."
that's why I brought him up, because Ethan has long said that there's much more of a market for the novel, not only in terms of sales, but people seem to be hungrier in Hollywood and places like that for novels as opposed to short stories. And he says, what I'm hearing from you and what I've heard from Ethan and other certainly literary figures is the short story is given too much short shrift. It's not valued as much as it should be. The novel has had a kind of ascendancy over it.
Yeah, which I think in some respects is understandable, that if you're going to go to a bookstore and spend $16 or $25 on a book, you want something you can sink your teeth into, that you want characters who will last for more than 24 pages. I think that there is a sense that with short stories, almost like you're on different levels of a video game, where you have to refresh yourself and reacclimatize yourself to the environment and to the characters with each new story. So I do understand the impetus to value novels over short story collections, but I think that then you lose this quintessentially American form of storytelling.
But it just occurred to me that in A Constellation of Vital Phenomena and in this book, if this was your first story, you start with an artist in both. And I'm just wondering what drew you to the idea. I mean, Ahmed in Constellation is a bad doctor, but trying to be an artist, and you have an artist who has to counterfeit and do all this work for the glory of his nationality and the USSR. I mean, are you a painter? Are you drawn to painting at all? Canvas type of art?
I've done one painting in my life, which is hanging in my parents' home, sort of in this little corner of pity. No, I've got I have no artistic talent whatsoever, but
interested in the artist though.
I mean my girlfriend's an art historian, so I sort of am hearing about art all the time. I think that one of the things you're trying to think of as a writer or really a storyteller of any kind is how you can convey certain ideas in ways that are dramatically interesting. So I generally think that books about writers are often pretty often suffer perhaps the limitations of their subject matter, let's say. There's only so much, so much drama I think you can get out of watching somebody in front of a typewriter typing away. And yet, with portraiture in particular, I think you can actually watch, stroke by stroke, a human face emerge from a blank page. And there's something about that I find just arresting. This idea of individual faces just appearing out of nowhere from nothing but an artist's mind and talent.
Well, I'm struck by, in your work, especially, in the terms of the artist who's trying to change faces and get his brother in there and all the rest of that. And it comes up in your work repeatedly, this sense of loss and memory. And do you think when you're telling a story, when you're weaving a story, that these are your motifs, these are your themes, or that they just sort of burgeon and come out of the story?
Yeah, I think, to some extent, any writer is I would think, sort of dealt a particular hand, and you can play that however many times you want, but there's still a few things that really fascinate you, and this idea of how we try to remember, and the ways in which we alter and fabricate our memories and our pasts as individuals, but also as societies. Something that seems particularly important.
The histories we write. Exactly,
and this can be, I just remembered this last night when I was talking with my family. So the first story in Tsar is about this portrait artist who was tasked with erasing and airbrushing out the faces of political dissidents. So maybe 5 years ago, I went to a family wedding. And I was seeing someone at the time, and she came with me, and we had a big family photo, and she was in this big family photo, and shortly after that we parted ways, and somebody in my family who's a graphic designer went and airbrushed her out of all of the pictures, and so now in the photo albums of this family wedding, there's this person who's no longer there, and as yet, she was there. She's in my memory. I remember that happening, that blank spot of, of a palm tree on the beach, and yet it's gone, and that's a pretty silly example, but
it's a great story of genesis of the story.
I know. I'm going to start using it as the...
Well, but what I'm struck by is, you're smiling, and you obviously have a wonderful sense of humor. You've laughed, you got some laughs from the audience, but your work is so serious and poignant and often dark. There are moments of humor, there are moments of irony and so forth, but for the most part, it's a pretty tragic vision.
I disagree with that.
Tell me why.
I think that I'm essentially a comic writer who writes tragedies. Would be my answer. But I think that I do feel like some readers think that that I might have nightmares each evening and wake up crying. But I don't. I sleep quite well. I think that art in general, I think, is a place where you can show the range of human experience. And I feel like I can get away with the kinds of scenes of sort of strange magic and exhilaration and and bawdiness, in part because the books also do go to these darker places. I almost see writing as a piece of music, where the lower you go, in the piece, the more those high notes stand out. I think that ultimately all of my books end on a note of hope and on a note of joy, and I think that the ultimate sort of vision of an artist isn't what you see necessarily along the way, but what you see at the end. And I think that by structuring the book that in some ways does delve through these circles of hell, it allows the reader and allows you as an artist the opportunity to go to some of these, these higher places.
Well, you can dramatize, as you do, I think, a certain human resilience and endurance and the ability to withstand and so forth. But I'm interested, and I think maybe the audience would be interested if you could tell us how the comic or the vision of yourself as a comic writer fits in to your book.
Well, I would say that that most of the subjects I've written about tend to have a very good senses of humor. I mean, I've never met people with sharper senses of humor than I did when I was traveling in Chechnya. That there's this sense of the absurd that I experienced there, a sense that humor is not only a way to make someone laugh or pass the time, but it's an act of resistance. It is a way of combating, perhaps even one's own reality. I was amazed at how folks could laser in on the one thing I was most afraid of, and then tease me mercilessly for it. So I was afraid of getting kidnapped, and so people. I remember this young guy said, "You can sit shotgun on the way there, but you'll be in the trunk on the way back." And the idea that humor, is not simply levity. That there is real, moral urgency in a joke, is something that I genuinely believe.
How important in your craft is language? You seem very precise and certainly extremely attuned to finding words that fit what you need to describe or what you want to describe and so forth. Is it paramount? Is it as important, for example, as just getting a story told?
Yeah, I think that those two impulses are always kind of are always sort of knocking one another out of the driver's seat as I work. My first draft of Constellation was written over a period of time where I really only focused on the crafting of story. And I went back through it a couple months ago, and I was really amazed at how bad the language was. There was just page after page of, for some reason, I was really into using a grilled cheese as a simile. Just everything was like a grilled cheese sandwich in that book, and it was the act of, once I sort of knew what my story was, once I had the sort of arc, I retyped the book from scratch 4 times, and it was each time through that the language became more refined and refined. It was the process of sort of tapping into whatever that initial burst of creativity was, but also when you retype something, you have to weigh and evaluate each word anew in a way that you wouldn't if you were simply reading through. So the process of writing that first book was really one of moving from story sort of to language. I would say for Tsar and the book I'm working on now, it was almost the reverse experience, where I would rewrite a paragraph 10 times and then move on to the next, and it was a much more sort of arduous task of trying to see if the story could be wrung from language rather than the other way around.
But each one is a kind of challenge and excitement in its own, or is charged in its own way. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think that if the language doesn't seem alive to me, then the story isn't going to be alive. That the story is predicated upon the language itself.
And there's an inner device that tells you that? There's what Hemingway called the Geiger counter or the BS detector?
Yeah, somewhat. I mean, I would say that that my BS detector is usually about 2 years too late. There's this beautiful Zadie Smith interview or article, I can't remember what it was, but she said that she was asked sort of when she knew that a page, a sentence was right, or when her book was finally done, when she made her final revisions. And she said that she knew what her final book looked like 2 years after it was published in the green room of the Glastonbury Writers Festival or something. And I think that's often the case, that a book isn't, you never finish a book, you merely conclude it. It's almost like, it's almost like this snapshot in time of where you were. I would have rewritten both of my previous books differently had they been published today than if they were published, when they were.
So you're one of these writers who came through a whole, what I would describe as writing education with the Iowa Writers Workshop, which I alluded to. You were a Stegner Fellow, which is a very elite group of creative writing students at Stanford. How much of that really contributed to your maturity and your growth and your ability to be the writer that you are? And how much of it is just separately kind of a knack or an intuitive ability to tell stories, do you think?
Yeah, it's a great question, and my education, I feel like even goes back a little earlier. I graduated high school, and I didn't know if I didn't really want to go to college. I wasn't quite sure about that, and so I was working just at a retail store in my neighborhood and living at home, and my mom was worried that my gray matter might atrophy without a bit of exercise, and so I signed up for this writing class at a local community center, and it was geared toward retirees, and so I was 18 or 19, and everybody else was much older, and I remember just feeling like I had found my people almost.
Your tribe.
My tribe, yeah. That I was just surrounded by these individuals who had lived these incredible lives and who had these fascinating stories to tell, and I remember just thinking, just getting this sense of possibility, I guess, where I could go home and look at the empty page and sort of transform it into something. And I'll never forget, there was this one elderly gentleman, and at the beginning of each of our classes, we'd share our work, and you'd always say something nice about whoever's it was. You would comment on the font or the printing quality or something. And my turn came up, and this gentleman, he always wore a suit and tie to this. He sort of crossed his fingers and he said, "I believe if you can't say anything nice, you shouldn't say anything at all." And he proceeded to say nothing for the course of my time. But Adam Johnson, who was one of my professors at Stanford, I remember him describing his own sort of path to realizing that this was something that he wanted to do. And he described it as almost this discovery that his deficiencies could be transformed into assets. So things like introspection or rubbernecking or a tendency to exaggerate. That these things that might not make you ideally suited for other lines of work are really things that you need to be a decent writer. And I kind of feel like I had a similar experience, and sort of after that class at that community center, I really sort of took to it and went on with it. And I would say that to sort of go back to the original question, that the sort of the professionalization of creative writing and sort of the way that writers get routed through these various programs and workshops. In my case, I felt like it was tremendously beneficial. I'm not sure if I necessarily learned anything that I wouldn't have picked up at some point, but I feel like it may have taken sort of 20 years in the wilderness and condensed it down to 2 or 3.
I have my own bias because I've been teaching literature for many years and attract a lot of creative writing majors, and I tell them, you might learn more from studying the masters than you would from these workshops where you're reading each other's work. Mm-hmm. Any thoughts on that? Yeah,
I mean, I would absolutely agree. I think that that the programs that I was fortunate enough to go to, the work of sort of the greats were integral to the experience in class, and the fact that you would simply be plugged into all of these writers that you hadn't been previously aware of. I do think that I don't know, that I think to some extent that I feel like there is this kind of slightly morally questionable aspect of some of these programs where you're asking students to take out debt and spend all this money for poetry degrees. That seems a bit ridiculous.
Let me talk with you just again about your characters, because I said they're pretty fully realized and multidimensional. Do you inhabit them, or do they inhabit you?
I'm not sure. I think that it's a two-way street. I would say that often it'll be when I'm going for a run or cleaning the kitchen or something, where I'll suddenly understand something about a character through something about a story through these characters that sort of seemingly comes out of nowhere. And when you're in front of your screen, you're trying to inhabit their world. I think that one of the ways that I tried to make some of these characters whose experiences are so vastly different from my own, to make them lifelike, is to breathe some of my own life or emotions, what have you, into their particular storylines, simply to feel like despite the fact that there is this distance, that they're still of me and my creation.
So a lot of people read Anthony Marra and exclaim, "Wow!" or "That really affected me. That really had an enormous impact on me." Who are the storytellers that have had that effect on you?
Yeah, I would say sort of my top five or what have you would be Edward P. Jones. He's a writer that really had an enormous effect on me. He's a Washington, D.C. writer. He's only written 3 books.
African-American writer.
African-American writer, yep. He wrote 2 books of short stories and 1 novel called The Known World that is exquisite. I think it's one of the great books.
As a stylist as well as a storyteller.
Yeah, sort of every notch you can touch, he does it in that book. I think David Mitchell is somebody who really had a big impact in terms of thinking about how you can inhabit a voice. His voices, I think, are so profoundly weird and shot through with so much love and humor. I think Zadie Smith is, again, as a stylist and just as a thinker, her mind works in such exquisite ways, I think. And maybe lastly, I would say Mario Vargas Llosa, the Peruvian novelist. The Feast of the Goat was maybe his best known work, but he was somebody who emphatically believed that political and sort of social issues should be addressed in fiction. And he really believed that a citizenry that's sort of been well educated in empathy through books have an effect on history. And that sort of almost that incredibly optimistic view of what a book can do is something that certainly.
Do you look at fiction that way, that it can be socially or politically educational, even didactic, useful?
I think so. I mean, we're sitting here in Marin talking about a book set in Russia and Chechnya, and I think that we are willing to go places in a novel that we might not otherwise be willing to go. That I think there's something about a gripping story and beautiful language and characters that you can really, clasp onto. That if you can do that, readers will be willing to go to the other end of the world, I think. And that's not necessarily I don't think that's necessarily true with other genres and mediums.
I'd be interested to know what your thoughts were when the two Chechen brothers became implicated in the Boston Marathon bombings. I mean, certainly it was an international story, it was a lurid headline type of story, but at the same time, you know, it came out of that world that to some extent you were better acquainted with than most Americans, to be sure.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I was obviously absolutely horrified by the incidents. I remember speaking with a Chechen refugee, a friend of mine who lived in Boston, and I think there was only about 5 Chechen families there at the time, and he knew, you know, not closely, but he knew of the Tsarnaev brothers, and I remember him just saying how ashamed he was of them, that you know, for him, America was this place that literally saved his life. He would be dead if he didn't receive asylum here. And that these two brothers who had never experienced the Chechen conflict themselves had somehow come to, you know, to idolize these extremists and perpetuate that form of violence was something that he thought was so misguided and disgusting and just an insult to the country that, you know, that took him in. And I was really, I was really shaken up by it. I would say that this was, you know, a place that I had traveled to and knew a number of people who were living here, who had left that region, and just seeing how this you know, this terrible tragedy had made them sort of less secure as Americans was really horrific, I think.
Well, novelists back in the day were often asked their political opinions. It's not as common as it used to be, and they would quite willingly and almost sometimes promiscuously opine on all kinds of political things. I'm just curious to know, I mean, if you've given much thought to the present situation in Chechnya, because it's so fraught with complexities, particularly where the relationship with the Russians is concerned, and particularly where the jihadist movements that continue to percolate and burgeon up one way or another are, I mean, recently, for example, in Leningrad, we had this explosion that went off, and there's constantly that terrorist threat at the same time that you bring these people alive in ways that we want to see them as ordinary, regular people. Yeah. So any thoughts just about, you know, that whole polarization with the jihadist movement in Chechnya now?
Yeah, I mean, I would first say that judging an entire population based on the actions of a few is generally
stupid.
Yeah, I mean, we produce, you know, plenty of people we wouldn't want to be associated with here at home. Some of them become president. But I think that it is this precarious situation presently, and you know, there are you've had on your show people who are much better informed on the ground politics than I am. I think that I suspect that for the next few years things are probably going to be relatively stable. That the current president Ramzan Kadyrov seems to sort of have a hammerlock on power there. It seems to be more based in his personality and you know, his sort of strongman tactics than it does on any kind of institutional stability. I suspect that when a number of these Russian fighters who've gone to Syria and Iraq, when they come home, I think that's when things are going to get, you know, particularly bad.
Do you have to tell stories? Is it like compulsory for you to tell stories? Could you, for example, make yourself not tell stories?
Yeah, I'm a terrible procrastinator. I have to make myself tell stories, I think. No, I mean,
I'm asking you if you're driven, really, if you're impelled to do it, to be a storyteller.
I think it goes in shifts. I think sometimes you have something to say and sometimes you don't. and when you don't, you should probably be quiet.
Some questions. How did you arrive at the idea of the mother who washes dishes while looking at a picture of the Black Sea? I was very moved by this image of a female experience.
Oh, well, thank you. In the novel, one of the main characters' mothers lives in Siberia, about 100 kilometers north of the Arctic Circle, just sort of surrounded by snow and tundra and ice. And she has this little postcard of the Black Sea that she's pinned above the sink. And as she's washing the dishes, she imagines that that she's in the Black Sea, and it sort of becomes this little motif sort of throughout that character's story as he eventually scatters her ashes in the Black Sea as an adult. I just kind of love that image of somebody who's not looking out the window at the ice, but is instead looking at the wall at this little postcard of the Black Sea. It seems like it's almost a small little metaphor for art itself, that now and then we choose to turn away from the ice and the snow in the winter and focus on a little patch of sunshine on a postcard. I think, for me, that's what a good book is.
Thank you for your questions, by the way. We'll go through as many of these as we can, time permitting. How has your work been received in Russia and Eastern Europe?
It's been received, I suppose I would say, with enthusiastic indifference. I had the real honor of going to do some readings in Moscow and St. Petersburg, actually right after the election. The ambassador to Russia at the time, the American ambassador, had read Constellation and had invited me out to do some readings. And within the liberal writers and intellectuals who came to these American embassy-sponsored events, it went over well. But I suspect that for the most part, there's not much appetite for hearing what an American thinks about a country that they live in.
The question that we covered some of this, but maybe you might go into more detail or more of a response to the way this is phrased. What is your deep connection to Chechnya? Is it a family history? You seem to have deep roots and cultural understanding of the soul. Excuse me, I'm not sure I can read this, but I think they're asking about your deep understanding of Chechnya, and where's the source of that?
Well, it's not familial, I'm not sure that I do have a deep a deep understanding of any soul, really. I think that it was a place where I found so much in individuals that I had read about, in people that I'd met, that I felt like I recognized from my own life. I'm a humanist. I believe that generally speaking, we're more alike than we are different. And I just felt that so many of these stories that seemed so powerful, and these voices that generally had no expression or outlet here in America. There hadn't been a novel available in English about these wars in Chechnya before Constellation. That idea of sort of in some way trying to shed a light on this particular place was my motivation.
Reference to Tsar in the title, the novel's structure, setting conjure up Tolstoy. Question, is there any hope for these characters or, I'm sorry, not, is there some defects in handwriting here? No. I think what they're asking for is how much Tolstoy affected you, or to what extent Tolstoy affected you.
Yeah, I would say that Tolstoy affected Constellation, my first book, perhaps more than it did Tsar. one of the things that I really admire about Tolstoy is the fact that he sort of strips his prose from any kind of judgment, and you feel as if this writer, is simply describing the characters he sees and has experienced, and allowing the reader to arrive at their own conclusions. And that was something that I really tried to take into the prose of Constellation. It's funny that when I would ask people in Chechnya what their favorite book was, they would usually say Haji Murad by Tolstoy. And so you had the favorite book of this Chechen people who, in many ways have defined their identity in opposition to all things Russia, sort of loving the work of the quintessential Russian novelist. There's, in fact, a museum dedicated to Tolstoy in Chechnya, and it was the only museum in the region that remained open throughout these wars. And it was because this family that ran it found so much in Tolstoy's work in this time of deprivation.
Well, you were demurring a little bit about, addressing political type of issues. You're a fiction writer, but fiction writers, as I said, traditionally often do opine on different political things. So here's someone who says, can you comment on President Trump's concern for truth and facts and how similar they may be in terms of what Russia does in your book? You think we have a demagogue in the making?
I think we have a demagogue in the made. I think that the most troubling moment in this entire presidency so far for me personally was Kellyanne Conway's Alternative Facts episode, because that I feel like really does get into the mentality that that has done a lot of damage in Russia, not merely during Putin's time in office, but throughout the 20th century. The idea that reality is subject to political approval seems absolutely ludicrous, and yet we see over and over again how that can happen. The book I'm working on now, part of it is set in Italy, and I was reading something just the other day about Mussolini. And when Hitler came to Rome to visit Mussolini got set designers to create all of these false fronts on either side of the road that was taking Hitler from the airport to downtown Rome, because they wanted Hitler to be impressed by all of these villas. And so there was this entire fake city of stage sets that Hitler drove past. And some of the people in Mussolini's army thought that this was a great idea. And so when Mussolini came to inspect the regiment and the battalion and whatever, they made artillery out of wood. And painted that, and sort of faked this, this whole battalion, and I suppose that seems like the end result of this, of what begins with alternative facts, is that it's not only the fact that you have a government or a source of power sort of delineating what is true and what is not. But it's also that spreads throughout a society so that people no longer recognize what's real. And that seems, incredibly dangerous. I think George Orwell probably said it best, that freedom is the ability to say 2 and 2 equals 4.
As you tell this story, I'm reminded in your work of the fact that, and I also certainly saw the influence of Tolstoy in the Constellation of Vital Phenomena, but there's also something of your work that reminds me of Chekhov, who may be the great certainly my top 3, 4 short story writers, and playwrights for that matter, because he was both. It's detail. It's grounding your work in detail, and sometimes eccentric detail, or just what you're able to absorb through your own research. It's a very important kind of platform for your work, isn't it?
Yeah, I think that that we tend to believe the slightly eccentric and the slightly outlandish more than we believe the mundane. That there's something about the nature of stories that we sort of grapple with the most colorful and the most specific and the most particular details, and that's what sort of creates the world of fiction. I think that that fiction doesn't work in generalities. It doesn't work on themes. I've had students who've come in with stories and they say that it began because they wanted to write about about courage or about honor or about some big idea, and those stories almost invariably fall flat because you're trying to almost build the roof before you've built you've built the walls. I think that fiction is built out of fiction. All fiction is an accretion of specific details, and that's really something that that I try to on every page and every sentence to be as pinpoint accurate as possible.
Well, one of my mentors was Walter Tevis. I don't know if you know. When I wanted to be a novelist, he wrote The Hustler and The Man Who Fell to the Earth, and was a very important figure in my life, The Color of Money. But he said, the best fiction is fiction which is about the ordinary but has in it the extraordinary.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I've heard a similar saying, perhaps, where good fiction is something that takes the mundane and allows you to see it anew. That if you can give the reader the experience of making tea for the first time, or opening a door for the first time, or kissing for the first time, and you can make that experience seem alive and electric and profound in a way that for the reader it may not have been for many years, then I think that's that's a gift.
I think we've at last come to the end, but let me just say your parents have immense reason to be proud of you. And it's always a delight to talk to you. Tony, thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.